Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Critters 3. So, Critters 3 honestly just kind of feels just like Critters 1, but they try to feel like they're upping the ante somehow, but it really just feels like the exact same movie as the first one. But even they try to do things of a less than like nature, where they try to don't do any bounty hunter stuff really in this movie whatsoever. Like it kind of goes into like Aliens 3 kind of territory where like the only thing that feels reminiscent from the first two movies is just the critters itself, but like it just kind of feels like Critters 3 was being done just so that way like they could get something out there, but reasonably. Like I think Critters 1 took so much money to do, obviously, where you have like topless women and you have like this big landscape of a use for people to have. But it just feels like Critters 3 was just kind of one of those where it's like, okay, let's go into a very classical way of doing a like sequel movie, which is to just do it in a apartment complex. Like look at Gremlins 2, apartment complex. Look at uh, Demons. Demons, the very first movie was done in a movie theater, and the second one was apartment complex. So, also, it was kind of interesting to see Annie, who is in this movie, who's in Critters 3. I also ended up seeing her in a movie called Monster Man that was done in 2003. Maybe at some point I might review that. I don't know. Um, I remember that seeing that movie very well. It's like a road trip kind of movie between two guys, and then eventually, like a woman comes into the mix of things. So, but anyways, we also have Leonardo DiCaprio in this movie, and we also have the kid from like uh, Kindergarten Cop in this film. So going into this, like I would say that they try to victory lap this movie where like they kind of remind you of the success of the other two films while trying to do every single thing different with the exclusion of the critters things from like from many of the other movies. But we get where eventually they use like the projectiles from the first film. They kind of use like the long distance weapons because I guess there's a very minimal amount of critters that are in this movie. So I guess it's just like a numbers thing. When there's a ton of critters around, you can not see them use the projectile weapons that they have. But when the critters members are just minimal, like I guess they end up having to forcibly use like the weapons to just kind of make it seem like there's a real legitimate threat there. Also, we can kind of see this being very much like a puppet movie compared to the others, where like they kind of made you forget about that through the other movies, whereas like this one feels like obvious as day that it's like a puppet kind of film. Um, Again, that could just come down to budget. That could just come down to any number of things that eventually just like who knows with these films. No offense to the person that did this movie or whatever. I just thought it was goofy that they used the footage from the other two films. Like, we had to remind people, hey, Charlie was in the other films, so root for him, I guess. I don't think that we spend enough time on certain characters to really garner us really wanting to root for anybody in this movie, in all honesty. Like, I guess you could root for Charlie just because he's been in the other films, but I just feel like they try to do a lot of goofy things with these characters that I didn't really enjoy. Like I think it was a bizarre sequence that we had where kind of Clifford, after some point, was kind of like window shopping for like for a mother of his family in some part of this movie. Um, Really, I think instead of really investing on any one person, they kind of had to just invest on the whole apartment complex getting out of this movie. Because really, the entire film was just people coming up with some kind of random way to eventually defeat these things, either by like finding some thing that they can turn into a weapon to attack these things, really we go right back to the very first film a lot through this. So with that said, like I think that's all that I have to say about this movie, and so let's go out of our way to go into that double five time territory and just say it's about that coveted time again to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So very beginning of this, we have a road trip of a movie where I'm just like, okay, like I can see where, like in the beginning of like Critters 2, we had that bus come in with Bradley Brown. Uh, Whereas in this third one, I'm just like, okay, there might be a road trip to get somebody to come back from the sequel to come here. But then I'm like, but wait a minute, like there's nobody from original movie to come here. But I guess they just slid in like Leonardo DiCaprio, and they just kind of slid in some people that I guess are like significant actors and whatever. Just because I guess like some people are just like, dude, I'm kind of done after this one, or maybe they like they just couldn't figure out anybody that would want to return, or maybe they didn't want to put up enough money for anybody to return, with the exclusion of Charlie, who was just like, hey man, like whatever you're willing to pay me, because I just want to do a film. So going into this, we have this RV of this family. And so, bizarrely, in the very beginning of the movie, we have to tell Annie has to tell Clifford, her dad, kind of bringing up that their like the family's mother has been dead for 2 years, and I'm just kind of like, okay, that seems like a weird thing to bring up in the very beginning of the movie. Because it's not like this guy is shopping around for anybody. It's not like he's hitting on anybody. It just seems like this is just a weird thing to just help us figure out that there isn't going to be a mom or mother in this family. I don't know. I don't know what that thing was. It just seemed weird. Thing of dialogue. So we have Johnny who ends up going off to this cliffside, just kind of look at this forest. All of a sudden we have Leonardo DiCaprio like running into the fray, grabbing this kid's arm and grabbing his frisbee. And this just looks so weird. like when looking back at it and looking at the scene, it just looks like Leonardo DiCaprio is trying to like be a bully to this kid and like grab his frisbee from him for some weird reason. So but Leonardo DiCaprio is to mention like, hey man, like there could be beavers in there, or there could be like bears in there, or there could be deer or whatever to come in there. There could be another kid that just fell down there. It's like, yeah, I fell down here, man, this sucks. And like there could be anything down there. And so what ends up happening is that Annie ends up coming in like, oh, thanks for like trying to not shove my kid down this like cliff. Like, hey, thanks for that. So eventually they all just decide to just play the frisbee that is just going to pretty much just end up in that forest location anyways, which just pushes Leonardo DiCaprio to slide down this little downhill of a thing, and I hope that he didn't injure himself, because he's not in this movie very enough. He's not very much in this movie, so it doesn't matter if he were to just like, oh man, I just broke my ankle, and that's why you don't see me enough in this movie, because I broke my ankle sliding down this hill. So, here's the thing. So, Leonardo DiCaprio just told this kid, like, hey man, don't go down there, but then he goes down there himself. Which, so DiCaprio tries to go after this frisbee, and is eventually, like, grabbing at it and trying to use his stick to get at it. But then all of a sudden we just have Charlie just come out of this bizarrish forest location to eventually remind us, hey, I was in the two other Critters movies, just so you guys know. And so what ends up happening is we have the Critters eggs that end up making their way underneath this little RV or whatever. And eventually they start to hatch once we get close to the people of the RV making their way to this apartment complex. Coincidentally, at that time, the RV eventually is to run out of brakes So it bizarrely just smashes into some other car once they are to get to this hotel complex, which I guess is just to coincidentally probably break a lot of these eggs or to justify them being broken so that way they can slide into this apartment complex. So we eventually push on to have this, I think, guy who is to be like the maintenance man of this like apartment complex, that also bizarrely he is to have kind of like rats in here. So I'm kind of wondering if like he's one of those that have kind of been releasing rats in this apartment complex to try to keep either people to go out of here, and so maybe they can get some like quick money or whatever, or I don't know. But so eventually Frank is to be this guy for a very long time in camera frame, and so eventually the critters are to hatch and are to eventually like start making their way into Frankie's spot. We have some woman who is to be Rosalie, who is to eventually dump her laundry down in the chute. And so evidently Frank is like, yeah, I love my job because freaking like cleaning women's underwear, I guess, like is his weird quirk of a thing. So you would have thought I wouldn't be a person that is gonna like go on and like have my laundry being sent down a chute. Like, no, I wouldn't trust that because what if like a lot of my stuff ends up getting like missing? Like, especially if it's like a collector's shirt or something, like a unique shirt that probably somebody's like, hey, I want this, whatever. But anyways, like as if my clothes are that just high end, whatever. So pushing on here. So eventually, Frank is to get attacked by these critters, thinking that it's probably some rodent or some rat or some whatever. And but eventually, these critters go after him and just chew the crap out of him. Uh, like eventually, they come from one of these like laundry things, and like it's kind of like you can kind of tell eventually once we get to the new binge how they might have like started to like reuse some certain things from this franchise, and I think the whole laundry thing was kind of like the like, oh, okay, that's where they got that from. The new binge was basically from this thing. So Frank is to die and just consistently getting eaten, but he ends up getting eaten in a place where no one is to exactly see. So eventually we just have these people of this apartment complex just kind of talking to one another. We have Annie who's asking about a job from the post woman, or I think her name is Marcia. Uh, Eventually, seemingly the superhero of, or the hero of this story, because she ends up having these like a billion road flares that she has to like bust them out through this whole entire apartment complex. When because newsflash, people, we have to bizarrely do this thing where we have to conveniently, like in every single one of these critter movies, when it's done in a small place, we have to take out the phone cords for whatever reasons, and then we have to also like take down the power as well. Like in the very first movie, we had the critters who ended up doing that themselves, but in this third movie, we have to bring in a guy specifically just to do this thing, which I thought was stupid. I honestly didn't quite understand why exactly we had this big Goomba of a man when eventually we didn't really need it. I'm trying to figure out here which is the Goomba of the man. That's probably got to be Briggs because he's the only one that doesn't have a picture of it. Um, Either Briggs or Mario. I don't know who was Josh's dad. I'll probably just say Josh's dad throughout this whole thing. So, but anyways, so we have like several people just like it feels like they just have random conversations with a lot of these people in the neighborhood to just kind of connect them to eventually when they are to be rescued towards the end of this film. there's some kind of setups of having like, oh, so these people aren't strangers with one another. They've spent quite a bit of time with people. I think, no, I think Mario, so it must be Briggs then. Mario is the guy that you end up seeing him like collecting all of his stuff and trying to eventually leave. Okay, I'm trying to figure it out now. So it must be Briggs. So going on into here, what eventually starts to happen is Rosalie ends up going down to get her laundry, and all of a sudden she used to see this like green goop coming onto one of her bras. So Rosalie thinks that somebody went a little plah 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 freaking and dusted her underwear. So she's like perv. So eventually she starts collecting her stuff, and eventually we have the critters who end up starting to pop out of this washer and dryer to eventually come after Rosalie. We have at one point where Rosalie is to dump the bleach down on the ground, and eventually one of the critters end up getting disfigured. Like, I guess we have to always have one critter that is to either stand out or one critter who is to seemingly be the leader. I think they have to like come up with some kind of design to make it seem like there's always a leader. Like when looking at like Gremlins, they had the one gremlin that has like the stripe in the one's hair to, I guess, have him be the leader maybe. So going into this, so Rosalie is to eventually go and get her like leg chewed out, and eventually she ends up spotting Frank, who's to get consumed completely. Here's the thing though, so these critters do not change in size whatsoever through this movie. I guess these critters is just like, well, we couldn't have done a bigger one. We couldn't have done it like an actual human sized critter. We couldn't do that. We just didn't have the money in this movie. So they just went straight up with the puppets. Like no matter how many things that these critters consumed, all kinds of stuff, ate like an entire house worth of things, like they didn't change in size whatsoever. Which was just kind of like, okay, that seemed like that just felt like they just didn't have money in this movie. That's the sad, like, disheartened part about it. Like, they couldn't have like reused certain things from other films. They couldn't have just like, man, they had so much money in Critters 2. So, so eventually Annie is to eventually spot like Rosalie and how she's kind of just scared out of her wits. So Annie is to eventually tell her father about Rosalie and how like something had taken a bite out of her. And bizarrely they have this like random thing of like stuff that they have to mention what these critters are. Like they mention it's like cats, porcupines always seems like the normal thing, but like they mention it's like cats or giant rats, which doesn't make sense to me. Like they just kind of like mention any animal that seems to be that kind of size to justify that this could be like this critter, which like they also mention aliens, which is again like get in the ballpark. Like get into like roundabout, like say it's a bowling ball with teeth, or say it's like a hairy like a hairy monster of sort. I don't know. They could say it's like a head with teeth. I don't know. You could say any kind of thing. So, but like they're kind of like not in the ballpark in this one. So, what ends up happening is the critters are to show up and start launching their projectiles, and so both Rosalie and Clifford end up getting knocked out, and they start like. Here's the thing, like we have like when eventually these people are to try to be like dragged up to the certain kind of other floors. Eventually we just have it to where they're to mention that like these people could get poisoned or are poisoned or whatever. I'm like, clearly these people are poisoned, right? Clearly they're just gonna die right now. Like I'm just like, I thought that old man was kind of silly or stupid. about like, yeah, they're being poisoned, so they're gonna die soon. No, obviously, but I guess they just want to kind of kept it fast and loose with a lot of stuff that they're talking about in this movie. But anyways, like it's just kind of nitpicking. But anyways, so what ends up happening is these people are to just be like forced up the stairs, and eventually what ends up happening is Josh and his father ends up coming in, because I guess like Josh's father, it's like, hey, like I want money, like I need my money. So I guess since Josh's father couldn't find Frank, he all of a sudden quickly just takes like some pliers or whatever, and goes and kills both the phone and the power, and then eventually makes his way to just try to find people in the pitch black darkness, because I guess he just has a flashlight. So all of a sudden we eventually have Marcia, who has her road flares, that is to eventually go and help like collect Clifford and Rosalie and Annie and everybody else, and just kind of like get them to where like she's at, and eventually find a room that has like candles or whatever that's being lit. Really, probably just, I'm sure they just probably like put lights back on in one room, but then they like, oh yeah, candles. Oh yeah, like it probably, a candlelit room would have probably not been lit that well. Like somebody turn on the lights in that one room. Um, but like, anyways, so eventually we get where Josh's father is just kind of making it through this apartment complex, and eventually we have him, sadly enough, just get eaten by the critters. And eventually, Marcia is to talk to Josh, and Josh is like, hey, my father is getting killed. So Marcia is to finally see what this is, because like people had described it, but she didn't really understand it. So she eventually just goes and sees this critter just eating up Josh's father, and like sees what it looks like, but eventually they just run off. So what they all decide to do, considering there is no like bounty hunter seemingly in this movie whatsoever, because like even when they do technically have a bounty hunter, like he has a very limited weapon, which is technically Charlie, but luckily Charlie makes it back to this apartment complex and decides that like, and also we have like a Big Bang Theory moment where evidently the elevator of this movie is like out of order, which I'm like, so like what, could they have not have done anything with this elevator in this movie? Like, was it not allowed? Or are they just trying to like not use the elevator so that way they wouldn't have to like they wouldn't have a problem with certain scenes, or I don't know. It was just weird. Or maybe like this is like a place that is specifically to film certain movies, and so like, hey, like the elevator, like we don't have spots for that, so just say that the elevator is supposedly broken. But here's also the goofy thing: they still use the elevator in this movie technically. Good, so the elevator is broke, but they still use it, and so I'm really confused. So I was like, what the heck is up with the elevator? Let me know in the comments below. I desperately need to know. So I guess they had to save the elevator to the very end of the movie. I don't know. It was weird. Because eventually the elevator goes up, and both Charlie and Annie are just kind of like, ugh. They're kind of pressed. So anyways, what ends up happening is we have all the people who end up pulling like a 40 days 40 nights, or 30 days 30 nights kind of thing, or no wait, 30 days of nights, yeah, the Josh Hartnett movie where he's with the vampires, like 30 days of night, there we go, I think that's it. So what they decide to do is they all decide to go up into this attic and just try to hide from the critters. But coincidentally, by the time that these people are to make it up to the attic, that's when the critters are trying to make it into this like apartment room where they're conveniently. So like the critters don't go for the people at all, but then once they start to make it up to like the higher spot, that's when all of a sudden the critters just arrive and they're like, hey, um, because we had like Josh's character eventually like holding the door, and it seems like these critters are like ramming through the door. I'm like, man, like I could not justify the strength of these critters because I'm like, I don't think that you could just have them easily crack through a door. But I guess that's just me. I can see them probably eat through the door, but who am I to say? So going on into this, so they are in the attic, which is coincidentally like the very top of the elevator shaft is also like where the top of the attic is. So it's kind of like, yeah, like if they just wanted, like the critters could have probably just gone and figure out how to get into the elevator shaft and could have made it all the way to the very top of the building and then could have just worked their way down, which actually probably would have been like the smartest thing to do, but to each their own. Like I guess like they couldn't have taken any cues from like the Alien movies where the Alien movies would always go to like the very top of the thing and then just fall down, um, because that would be smart technique. So eventually we have Charlie who gets into the fold of this spot, because people are desperately asking for help, and coincidentally, Charlie is the only look by person that eventually is going to make his way um, to this apartment complex because it's familiar people. So Charlie is to make it here, and eventually he is to use his critter weapon to eventually start shooting some of these critters. But eventually it just gets to the point where this critter weapon that he has eventually just like malfunctions, and eventually like Charlie is to desperately ask Annie to fix it for him because she just has smaller fingers. So eventually it just gets where like Charlie and Annie are to be in the attic, and so eventually the critters just decide to just kind of climb up via the elevator like spot because that just seems kind of the convenient thing. So what ends up happening is that eventually like all these critters are now having to like just smash or all the people that are kind of left up there are now having to defend for themselves with basically nothing. Like I guess nobody of this apartment complex has any weapons whatsoever. So like one person is like covering the critters with a blanket, and then like I think Leonardo DiCaprio like smacks him with some kind of pipe or something. But that doesn't exactly kill the critter. Like it just kind of smushes the crap out of him. So they have to come up with like the flimsiest weapons that they can possibly attack these things with. So to eventually wait for Charlie to be able to use his weapon to take these things down. So we also have Marcia, who is bizarrely like hanging from like the roof of this place, and she's like desperately trying to call 911. By the time that she gets there and gets to call the 911, like basically all these critters are being handled and taken down with. So eventually we just get to I think the rooftop with Charlie and everybody, and eventually Charlie has to take down the one last critter, and he ends up like falling also in the RV that the family was to have, and eventually he ends up seeing the Marcia girl who's still like dangling from off of this roof, and like she's asking, it's like, well, hey, hopefully you can help me get down, but not like that. To where freaking he ends up like freaking falling. So seemingly all of the critters are to be dismantled, taken care of, and whatever. But eventually, what ends up happening after this is Charlie is to eventually find two eggs, and so what ends up happening is Ugg is to talk to Charlie and is to mention like, hey, like those two eggs that you have are the very last eggs of the Krites. So you can't kill these eggs because no species can go into extinction. I'm like, so wait a minute, like, where were you guys when like the humpback whales were happening, and like where were you when any number of like Earth things were eventually going to die off? Like, where were you in the endangered species list of any number of things that happened on our planet? Like, how could you have just averted that? So, but yeah, so Ugg is mentioning to Charlie that those are the very last eggs. And so eventually they're going to send a transport out for them to contain these things. And so Charlie's like, but wait a minute, like, how, like, when are you going to come for these? Because you need to come for them fairly quickly because eventually they'll hatch. So, what I'm assuming is going to happen is Charlie is probably going to be holding on to these eggs. Eventually he's going to lose them. Eventually they're going to hatch. And that's how we get Critters 4. I'm assuming that's what the fourth one is going to be about. So, really, we have it to where like that's how the last one kind of trickles out to be, that we kind of have the bounty hunters as there being like this Princess Leia kind of message at the end of this movie that we kind of have to wait for it to kind of trickle out to us via the credits. So with that said, that's kind of how this movie wraps up, but I'm going to wrap myself up and get out of here. Thank you guys for otherwise watching this. You watched it all the way through. There were some parts that I probably didn't go into much detail, but like this one just kind of doesn't, like, it isn't really much of a detailed movie, or there's a lot of just like the dialogue is just not really there. But other than that, like, I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.